We're now turned to politics and President-elect Donald Trump, who appears to have imperialism on the brain this holiday week. He targeted Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal in his Christmas message on Truth Social. It's an early indication of what's to come, potentially, from the incoming president when it comes to foreign policy. But Republican strategists are not worried, with one telling Politico, quote, crazy worked just fine the first time. Still, Canada seems to be trying to get ahead of whatever is coming down the pike, sending 2 members of Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet to Mar-a-Lago to continue the discussions Trudeau and Trump began last month. Meanwhile, President Biden is in the U.S. Virgin Islands, readying to leave the White House with little fanfare as Democrats try to turn the page on a poor year. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli from St. Croix. Mike, what's the very latest in terms of what the president is doing and is planning for his final 3 weeks?
Well, Richard, the word at the White House has been consistently since the election of Donald Trump that this president, Joe Biden, is going to be running through the tape in his final 2.5 months in office. Well, now he's down to just about 3.5 weeks, and the president does have a lot on his plate when he returns back to Washington, including, for starters, a trip to Rome, where he's going to be meeting with Pope Francis, as well as the Prime Minister and the President of Italy, 2 important allies and 2 key players, potentially as it relates to what it will happen as it relates to Europe in a Trump administration with regards to Ukraine. That's a top priority for the president, to see that continued support for Ukraine, to give them as much leverage as possible ahead of potential peace negotiated settlement with Russia. We're also going to see, though, the president try to realize some of his remaining domestic priorities, including to follow through on the demands from some key Democrats to use his pardon power, to use that commutation power to take some actions that can do what, in a minimal way, help follow through on promises he made as a candidate to see a more equal justice system. The president has already taken action with regard to people with non-violent offenses as well as drug-related offenses to either completely reduce or minimize their sentences so that they would match or in some way surpass what current offenses would be leading to. We're also going to see the president do everything he can to continue to shape his legacy. Just before Christmas break, the president gave a major speech at the Brookings Institution about his economic vision, his view that he really has changed the dynamic from a trickle-down policy of economics. We called it Reaganomics, too. He didn't call it Bidenomics this time, but a more middle-class focused approach. He's going to give a similar speech about his foreign policy legacy, maybe not necessarily to a domestic political audience, but to an audience of historians who will begin dissecting and unpacking his legacy for years to come. Richard.
Mike, stand by. I want to bring in political strategist and former senior GOP congressional advisor Rina Shah and former communications director and spokesman for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Michael Hardaway. Thank you both for joining us. Rina, I want to start with you on this. As Mike was talking about, as this president is now looking to finish up his administration, and he will be making a final trip abroad, in fact, which we'll get Mike to describe for us in a second. But we're also hearing what the president-elect is planning, or at least thinking about, when it comes to foreign policy and international security. What is to make in what we've seen in the last week? Certainly, we will be seeing, it appears, more of the way he administered his policy via social media in the coming 4 years.
One of Trump's central themes in his foreign policy was essentially keeping our allies and their adversaries on their toes. And that was something that he felt worked from the jump. From the time he took office, he really believed that that was the way to deal with again, complicated situations abroad. This time, he's coming in and inheriting different geopolitical tensions that I think change the game up a bit. But one thing we've seen already that he's foreshadowed for us is that he's not changing what I would call a route. The route is creating a fair amount of chaos, again, with relationships that should be solid, the one between us and Canada, for example. So I think what we're seeing here from Trump is not at all surprising to me, but I do think the timing that we're seeing it all play out in is quite interesting, though I don't think it really changes what I believe will be truly solutions-oriented policy, trying to achieve an outcome sooner than later, because that is what he feels that Biden failed on, that these conflicts are rolling, these conflicts abroad were prolonged, and that is something that Democrats do and that Republicans don't. That's going to be the challenge for him and his allies in Congress to show that.
Michael, who to watch in the balance of power here on the Democratic side? Certainly your former boss, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader in the House. We also have Senator Schumer as a leader in the Senate. Are those the ones that we should be looking to balance out these discussions when it comes to foreign policy?
That's exactly right. You should be looking at them. But I'd say to you, as you look at the House and really legislation and all of these things and how they might move forward, Republicans can only really lose one vote on any of these things. And so House Democrats will have an outsized influence on how all these things are shaped. And so Donald Trump can tweet and post and go on television and say whatever insane things he wants to. But the reality is that if there's anything surrounding legislation, it's going to be incredibly tough to get some of these insane policies through the House because they can only lose one vote. And the reality is that House Democrats will not vote for anything that's insane or too far right or something that doesn't serve the working people. And so that's something I think we should keep in mind in terms of all these rolling pieces of chaos from Trump, which is from a legislative capacity, he won't be able to get them through the House unless they're reasonably sane.
One of the things that we'll be looking forward to here, Mike Memoli, is that President Biden, his final trip going to the Vatican. Tell us about the significance of that. And the second thing, the first trip potentially for the president-elect will be to Davos, where all the world economic leaders will be at the same time, back to back, really, these trips of two different presidents.
Yeah, it certainly speaks to differing priorities for these two men. I think for President Biden, the trip to the Vatican in particular is one I'll be closely watching. President Biden is a devout Catholic. We have talked, he and I, quite a bit about his relationship with Pope Francis. This is somebody who, as the first Jesuit to become the leader of the Catholic Church, has a particular view as regards to social justice, is seen as a more progressive leader of the church than we have seen before. And he's also been somebody who he developed a very close personal relationship. Biden just met with Pope Francis last summer when he traveled to southern Italy for the G7 summit. And so this will be something of a farewell visit. Biden having attended Pope Francis's inauguration when he was vice president in 2013. But not to be overlooked is the meeting that President Biden will be having with Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. She is somebody who pleasantly surprised Biden administration officials because she comes from a more right-wing party. Members of her party leadership and others in her coalition had actually been very critical of the continued European support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. But Meloni, since becoming prime minister, has maintained, in fact, been a strong voice for continuing European and Italian support for Ukraine. So I think Biden is looking at that meeting as an opportunity to look at the sort of new generation of leaders in Europe. Meloni suddenly, even though she's one of the newer prime ministers, will very soon be one of the longest tenured prime ministers in Europe, as somebody who might be able to influence President-elect Donald Trump to continue at least efforts to give Ukraine the strongest hand possible as it relates to potential negotiations with Russia down the road.
Building on that, and over to you, Rina, on this. So traditionally, as you know, institutional Republicans focusing on foreign policy here, will we see that return potentially as a lame duck president, meaning he's not trying to get reelected? Might President-elect Trump, when he does take office, when he is inaugurated, take on a little bit more of that traditional element of being stronger on foreign policy? And might that start with Vladimir Putin, as Mike was talking about, regarding the issue of Ukraine? Because, at least from what we've heard so far, President-elect Trump is not fully eye to eye with Putin on Ukraine.
So the Putin-Trump relationship is certainly very complex in some ways, but also very simple. But talking about it right now doesn't serve us because he hasn't yet taken the oath, Trump, that is. So I think it's anyone's guess as to how Trump will tackle our role in supporting Ukraine or not. But one thing I think is bigger here is how much pro-business and tech leaders are not just at the table now with this future Trump administration. They are being involved not just to talk about their own endeavors, but they are being read in and being asked to lead in a way we have not seen in a very long time. And I would almost submit to you, ever. So this is a really phenomenal moment because Trump will go to Davos. And I think what he will want to show the world, he will want to project American strength by showing that we are competitive, we are innovative, and we are ready to really take on the world in that way. By showing off these, again, economic leaders from the private sector and tech leaders, he will really be looking to, again, project American strength. That is the phrase, that is the name of the game, and that is how he wants to get it done. Now, if we look at all these situations, him and Putin, him and Netanyahu, that's all anyone's guess because we don't really know what Trump's thinking. But already we know that pro-business policy is top of agenda for the next Trump administration. And also, I will just say this, I think he will have a challenge in Congress in getting what he needs done in that endeavor, in that way, because those endeavors require Democrats. And Hakeem Jeffries has proven to be a worthy adversary. He, I do not believe, will be just a splinter in the heel of Republicans. He can be, Leader Jeffries, a shard of glass. So that is one thing Republicans, and Trump in particular, should be wary of.